I was sipping a black coffee in a Seattle cafe when a message came through. You're out of the company, Jackson. Don't come in. Don't call. 10 words. That was it. No explanation, no warning. Just 10 words that detonated 7 years of my life. As the voicemail ended, I looked out at the construction cranes rising over the city skyline. Cranes I had put there. My name is Jackson Cole. I'm 33. And until this morning, I was the vice president of operations at Cole Built, the company my father built and I rebuilt. But apparently, legacy means nothing when fear and betrayal are louder than facts. Opening. The espresso machine hissed behind me like a pressure valve seconds from rupture, but my world had already exploded before the steam even cleared. I was sitting at Java Junction on 4th and Bell, my morning ritual spot, when my phone buzzed across the table with the precision of a gunshot. My hand, trained to respond to every call like it could shift $1 million project, instinctively picked it up. What I heard wasn't just unexpected. It was war. You're out of the company, Jackson. Don't come in. Don't call. My father's voice. No emotion. No hesitation. Just those 10 words. The screen dimmed to black, but the message echoed like a demolition charge detonating inside my chest. 7 years. 70-hour weeks. A dozen cities. Countless sleepless nights drafting bids, smoothing client fires, and walking through rain-soaked sites in steel-toed boots to meet impossible deadlines. And with one voicemail, it was gone. Wiped out like blueprints left in the rain. Around me, life went on. People laughed. Someone's name was called at the barista counter. Cups clinked. But I was frozen, disconnected, as if someone had unplugged my identity from the outlet. I had walked into that cafe as a VP. I was walking out a ghost. I didn't replay the message. I didn't need to. I knew that voice. I knew the finality in it. Hank Cole didn't bluff. He didn't negotiate after he made a call. That message wasn't just a door closing. It was the entire damn building collapsing. I stared at the phone. I could scream, call back, march to headquarters, and demand an explanation. But instead, I opened my text app, typed a single word, and hit send. Understood. If you're watching this, maybe you know what it's like to be blindsided. To give everything, only to be shut out without a second glance. Maybe you're sitting in your own metaphorical coffee shop right now, reading this with trembling hands and a heart that feels like rubble. But I promise you, foundations can be rebuilt. Long before I ever wore a suit or stood in front of multi-million-dollar stakeholders pitching net zero campuses, I was a scrawny kid riding shotgun in my father's battered Dodge Ram, boots swinging over the floorboard, smelling like sawdust and engine grease. Back then, Spokane wasn't just home, it was blueprint paper. Every street, every lot, every creaking frame of a house under construction was a piece of his growing empire, and I was the kid who asked too many questions and never said no to a shovel. Hank Cole wasn't what you'd call a gentleman. He believed in hard work, in keeping your boots dirty and your handshake firm, and he never wasted a word he didn't mean. He started Cole Built in '86, 2 years before I was born, with little more than a rusted toolbox and a reputation for doing what he said he'd do. He was the guy people called when other crews left jobs half-finished. He didn't talk about legacy back then. He was too busy chasing overdue invoices and fixing leaky roofs himself when subcontractors flaked. But every swing of that hammer was, unknowingly, laying the foundation of a future he expected me to inherit. I grew up learning measurements before multiplication. On Saturdays, when other kids were at soccer practice or birthday parties, I was hauling lumber and cleaning up job sites for $5 an hour and a soda from the corner gas station. I hated it sometimes, the sweat, the blisters, the way my friends looked at me like I was from another planet. But even then, a part of me liked the clarity. In construction, things made sense. You planned, you measured, you built. And when something cracked, you didn't talk it to death. You tore it down and did it better. By high school, I was obsessed with sustainable architecture, solar arrays, passive heating, recycled steel. My dad rolled his eyes at first, called it tree hugger science, but he didn't stop me either. I took drafting electives, interned at a green architecture firm during my senior summer, and applied to the University of Washington with a single focus, to learn everything I could about how to build smarter. College was the first time I truly stepped out of Hank Cole's shadow. I double majored in civil engineering and environmental design, graduated magna cum laude, and co-led a student project that got the university's first LEED Gold certification. Tech firms came calling before I even walked across the stage. San Francisco, Denver, Boston. But my heart, foolishly or not, was in Spokane. I want to come home, I told my dad over the phone that June. Help take Cole Built to the next level. There was silence on the other end, just long enough for me to wonder if he'd hung up. Then a short grunt. Your funeral, kid. I joined the company not as a prince, but as a worker. I started with safety compliance and procurement, moving from site to site, clipboard in hand, fielding rolled eyes from grizzled foremen who saw me as the boss's kid playing dress-up. But I earned my place. When I identified supply chain redundancies that saved us $100,000 in one fiscal year, I got my first promotion. When I introduced modular scheduling and digital blueprint platforms that shaved weeks off timelines, my father reluctantly handed me more control. And when I brokered our first major public-private partnership in Seattle, a mixed-use development with renewable energy targets, he gave me the title of VP of Operations. Not that he ever said, "I'm proud of you." That wasn't his language. His praise was letting me run point on bids, giving me the corner office that used to be his, trusting me, at least I thought, to carry the family name forward into a future that didn't look exactly like the past. We expanded fast. Offices in Portland and Boise, a staff that tripled in size, media coverage, awards, invitations to speak at national conferences. I was the face of the company now, the future-forward son of a blue-collar legend, bridging old grit with new vision. Clients trusted me. Employees followed me. And for the first time, I believed I was more than just a placeholder in my father's legacy. But what I didn't know, what I refused to see, was that the very foundation I believed we were building together had fault lines running beneath it. I thought my innovations were a bridge between generations. In truth, they were wedges, ones I had unknowingly driven deeper with every success. Looking back now, it's painfully clear. The tension wasn't new. It had been simmering under the surface, quiet and patient, like a structural crack waiting for the perfect storm. And it would only take the right pressure and the wrong people to make the whole thing snap. And snap it did. But I wouldn't understand just how deep the betrayal went until months later, when all the handshakes, awards, and headlines had been replaced by silence, and the name Cole Built no longer belonged to me. The first crack didn't sound like shattering glass or the wrench of metal. It sounded like a compliment. "You've done more in 5 years than most firms do in 15, Greg Thornton said as he shook my hand after our first formal meeting. "Your father's lucky to have you." It was a line wrapped in charm, slick with sincerity, and at the time I believed it. I was flattered, even. Thornton was a seasoned name in the Pacific Northwest, former CEO of Granite Spire, a major construction outfit that had crumbled under lawsuits and bad investments. But the man still held sway. And if Hank Cole was bringing him in, I assumed it was because he respected my progress and wanted support for our next phase of growth. I was wrong. It started subtly. Greg started attending more meetings. At first, he observed, offering a polite nod here and there, asking the occasional question that felt more like a test than genuine curiosity. Then, he began speaking, casually, but with an authority no one had granted him. We did something similar at Granite Spire. In my experience, the client prefers this approach. My father, who used to bristle when anyone interrupted him, just nodded and listened. Within a month, Thornton had an office. Within 6, his son Kyle was suddenly shadowing our project managers and sitting in on sales calls. I asked my father about it one afternoon. Our quarterly numbers spread out on the conference table between us, glowing with the proof of our momentum. "Greg's just here for strategic input," he said, brushing away my concern like sawdust. "And Kyle's young, eager. Let him get his feet wet. Doesn't mean anything's changing." But things were changing. Contracts I used to approve began arriving with revisions. Initiatives I had led, our sustainable materials program, the hiring pipeline for underrepresented workers, were placed under review. At first, I told myself it was a natural growing pain, the result of a company scaling up, preparing to go national. But the feeling was there, quiet but insistent, like a low vibration under concrete. I started noticing closed-door meetings. At first, I chalked them up to strategy huddles or investment talks. But I began catching pieces of conversations in the hallway. Terms like liquidity event, legacy repositioning, restructuring. Language that didn't fit the daily operations of Coalbuilt. Language that smelled like a pivot I hadn't approved or even been told about. Still, I pushed forward. I presented a citywide bid for eco-modular housing in Olympia, a project that would have opened up an entirely new vertical for us. I met with architects, ran the cost projections, even lined up municipal partnerships. When I brought it to the board, Thornton interrupted me 3 minutes into the pitch. "Too ambitious," he said, shaking his head. "Good idea in theory, but the return window's too long." My father nodded. "Let's table this, Jackson. We got other priorities." I felt heat rise to my face, not just because I disagreed, but because I could see the tide shifting. It was no longer my voice they were listening to. It was his. I stayed late that night, alone in the office, flipping through old project photos, trying to make sense of how something I'd built so methodically was starting to slide through my fingers. On my desk was a framed photo from our first high-profile groundbreaking in Seattle. My dad and I, arms around each other, both in hard hats, both smiling. It was one of the only times I remember him showing pride in public. I stared at it, wondering if he still saw that day the way I did, or if he'd rewritten the memory to fit this new direction. Over the next month, I began to be excluded from meetings entirely. My assistant would apologize awkwardly. They rescheduled at the last minute, she'd say, avoiding eye contact. Once, I returned from a site visit to find a group of investors touring the office, with Kyle leading them through what used to be my workspace. Then came the data. Our system log showed my access had been reduced. Certain folders, financials, hiring forecasts, vendor communications, now required permission I didn't have. When I confronted IT, they shrugged and said it must be an administrative error. But I knew better. I tried talking to my mother. She and I weren't close, not in the way families on holiday cards pretended to be, but she had always been the buffer, the one who helped translate my father's silence into something bearable. We met for coffee in Spokane, away from the office. She seemed distracted, tense, stirring her tea so long the ice melted. "Jackson," she said finally, "your father's not himself lately. He's worried. About the future. About you two." "Me?" I laughed. "I've delivered the most profitable 3 years in company history. I've doubled our team. We've outgrown our regional footprint. What exactly is he worried about?" She looked pained. "He thinks you're moving too fast, that you're turning the company into something he won't recognize." The words landed with a dull thud in my chest. I wanted to argue, to shout, to demand she talk some sense into him. But I didn't, because deep down, I knew that was exactly what he believed. And Greg Thornton had only amplified that fear. I walked out of the cafe that day with a pit in my stomach. It was the first time I realized I wasn't just fighting for my vision. I was fighting for a company that might already be slipping away. And I was starting to lose. The morning the axe fell began like any other Tuesday. Gray skies over Seattle, a steady drizzle tapping the windshield of my truck as I pulled into the site lot at North Harbor. I remember the smell of wet concrete in the air, the echo of steel beams clanging in the distance, and the dull thrum of workers arriving in staggered waves, neon vests blinking like fireflies in the fog. It was business as usual, or so I thought. I had a meeting with Greenline Partners at 10 a.m., a game-changing opportunity for Coalbuilt. We were about to pitch our proposal for a sustainable commercial complex on the south end of Lake Union. Net zero energy use, stormwater recapture systems, locally sourced materials. I had spent the last week preparing for it, crunching numbers deep into the night, aligning every design element with both environmental benchmarks and projected investor returns. It wasn't just a job. It was the kind of contract that could elevate our brand to a national contender. The pitch went better than I could have imagined. Martin Riley, Greenline's executive director, shook my hand as we left the table, his voice calm but deliberate. Jackson, this is the kind of leadership we need in this space. We'll be in touch soon, but I think we've found our partner. I walked out of that boardroom lighter than I'd felt in months. The chaos back at Cole Built. The whispers, the passive-aggressive undermining, the strategic oversights, faded to static behind the hum of possibility. I called my father on the drive back, eager to share the news. It went to voicemail. No big deal. I left a message, upbeat, respectful, concise. I pulled into my usual coffee spot, a small, wood-paneled place tucked between a florist and a print shop, and ordered my regular, black, no sugar, extra hot. As I waited for the barista to call my name, I opened my email, already drafting my internal debrief notes, when my phone buzzed in my coat pocket. The screen lit up, Dad. Relief swept through me. Finally, some recognition. Finally, a shared moment of progress, maybe even pride. I swiped to answer, but the call cut to voicemail. Odd. Then the voicemail notification chimed. I pressed play. Jackson. My father's voice was clipped, formal, unreadable. The board met this morning. We've decided to restructure leadership. Effective immediately, you are no longer with Cole Built. Your access has been revoked. Please do not return to the office. Your belongings will be delivered. This is final. Do not call back. The audio ended. Just like that. No, thank you. No, we'll talk soon. No acknowledgement of everything I'd sacrificed, the nights I spent in motel rooms instead of home, the weekends I skipped birthdays and barbecues to keep projects on track, the risks I took, the contracts I landed, the people I mentored. Final. I remember standing there, phone in one hand, coffee in the other, feeling the world slow down around me. Conversations around the shop blurred into indistinct noise. The smell of cinnamon and espresso suddenly nauseated me. A couple laughed behind me, completely unaware that my life had just been erased like chalk on a sidewalk before the rain. For a long moment, I did nothing. I didn't cry. I didn't yell. I didn't even move. I just stood there, staring at the screen, waiting for something, another message, a correction, anything to make it make sense. It didn't come. I thought of the team waiting for direction on the Green Line project. I thought of my assistant, who would show up at her desk and find my name missing from the staff list. I thought of the office I designed myself, the glass dry erase board filled with color-coded project maps, the framed photo of my first side job with my dad. All of it was being packed into boxes by strangers. I took my coffee, untouched, and walked out into the rain. I drove for hours, past buildings I'd helped construct, apartment towers, public libraries, schools. Each one a monument to long nights, hard calls, high stakes. Each one, now a ghost in my rearview mirror. I passed the new medical clinic in Ballard, built 3 months ahead of schedule thanks to a strategy I developed. I passed the commercial strip in Rainier Valley, where I had personally brokered a labor deal to hire at-risk youth. None of it mattered now. By the time I pulled into my apartment garage, the drizzle had turned into a downpour. I sat in the truck until the windows fogged over, gripping the wheel like it could anchor me to something real. Inside, the silence was deafening. I kicked off my shoes, peeled off my soaked coat, and stared at the blinking cursor on my laptop screen. An empty inbox. My work email was already deactivated. I opened my personal messages. No text from my father. No calls from anyone at Cole Built. Just one message from Greg Thornton's office assistant. Courier service will arrive Thursday to deliver your items. Please confirm address. I stared at it. Not even a full sentence from the man who had introduced himself as a family friend. That night, I poured a glass of whiskey and sat on the floor of my living room. I didn't feel rage, not yet. What I felt was hollowness, like someone had taken a wrecking ball to my chest and left me standing inside the rubble. I thought of replying to the voicemail, demanding an explanation, begging for clarity, but I didn't. Instead, I opened my phone, typed a single word, and hit send. Understood, because I knew, I truly knew, that if I was ever going to rise again, it wouldn't be by clinging to what had already collapsed. It would be by building something new from scratch, with no borrowed scaffolding and no one else's name on the door. And this time, I'd pour the foundation myself. The boxes arrived on a Thursday afternoon, just as the Seattle sky broke open with one of those sudden spring downpours that seemed to wash the city in grayscale. A delivery guy in a blue parka wheeled them up on a dolly, 4 cardboard coffins containing the remains of my professional life. No note, no signature required, just a clipboard and a forced smile as he handed over the form. From Cole Built, he mumbled, not meeting my eyes. I stood in the doorway of my apartment, the scent of wet cardboard mingling with the quiet inside, and felt the weight of the finality settle over me like a lead vest. I didn't open the boxes right away. For the first few hours, I just stared at them, stacked by the window like forgotten luggage from a life I no longer lived. Eventually, I gave in. Inside were the artifacts of 7 years spent building something I believed in. My framed degrees from UW, the engraved compass my project team had given me after our first successful commercial build, the leather notebook I used to carry to every site walk, still filled with handwritten observations and sketches. My personalized Cole-built hard hat sat awkwardly in one corner, the chin strap tangled, the logo smeared slightly with dirt from our last build. They had even thrown in the houseplant that sat on my desk, a peace lily I'd managed to keep alive through endless meetings and late-night spreadsheets. It had tipped over in the box, its soil spilled across documents and award plaques, as if someone had decided that even its roots no longer belonged. Near the bottom of the final box, I found a manila envelope containing a separation agreement. The legalese was cold, mechanical, boilerplate language about the board's right to restructure, clauses I had likely signed without blinking when I joined the company full-time. In exchange for 3 months severance and a non-disclosure agreement, I would waive all claims and agree not to pursue litigation or solicit clients. At the bottom of the final page was a yellow sticky note, signed in return for payment. It was in my father's handwriting. No apology, no explanation, just that familiar scrawl, the same one he used to leave notes on job site checklists and blueprints. Now repurposed to erase me. I didn't sign it. Not then. That night, I sat on the balcony of my apartment, sipping whiskey as the rain turned to mist and the lights of downtown shimmered like promises I no longer believed in. Across the skyline were buildings I had helped bring into the world. Structures born from late nights, heated meetings, split-second decisions. Concrete and steel given shape by my hands, my voice, my drive. But now, those buildings might as well have belonged to someone else. I tried calling my mom. Straight to voicemail. I tried the house line. Nothing. Even Ethan, my cousin who ran HR, didn't answer. I wasn't just fired, I was deleted. The next few days passed in a blur. My inbox filled with emails from confused clients, project managers asking for direction, vendors wondering about payment schedules. Some had heard the news already, some hadn't. I didn't have answers, and when I tried to reach out, I was met with silence or cold, professional deferrals. Then came the email from Martin Riley at Greenline. Jackson, just heard rumors about a leadership change at Colbuilt. Can we talk? The board is unsettled. You were the reason we felt confident moving forward. I couldn't bring myself to respond right away. Not out of pride, out of shame. How do you explain being ousted from your own father's company with a voicemail and a legal envelope? But I knew I had to. If not for me, then for the people who had believed in me, who had seen what I was trying to build before it all crumbled. On the 5th day after the voicemail, I met Jessica Park, my former executive assistant, at a diner on the edge of Belltown, far from our usual lunch haunts. She looked over her shoulder 3 times before she even sat down. I'm not supposed to be talking to you, she said, clutching her coffee like it was a lifeline. They made everyone sign NDAs, even the interns. Jessica, I said, my voice calm but hollow. I need to know what happened. Not the legal version. The truth. She took a deep breath, looked out the window at the slick streets, then leaned in. They've been planning it for months, she said. Since December at least. Thornton started pushing for a return to core value strategy, and your dad got spooked. Said the sustainability stuff was a distraction. Said you're going too fast. I shook my head. He was in every meeting. He greenlit every move I made. I know, she said, her voice trembling slightly. But Greg convinced him that you were positioning yourself for a takeover. Said you were building alliances behind his back. Even showed him emails. I blinked. What emails? They didn't show me, she said quickly. But, He said you were setting up to start your own firm, that you were trying to take clients with you. It hit me like a punch to the gut. The truth was worse than betrayal. It was sabotage. Thornton hadn't just taken my job. He had rewritten my intentions, weaponized my vision, and used it as the very reason to push me out. I paid for our coffees, hugged Jessica with the tightness of shared grief, and walked out into the drizzle again, colder than before. I didn't go home. I drove aimlessly for a while, past the waterfront, through the industrial district, watching cranes hover over half-built futures. Somewhere around Soto, I pulled over and sat in silence. Then I opened my phone. This time, not to text, not to call, but to begin. I opened a new note and typed a title at the top. Green Horizon, Phase 1 Plan. Because if they could take everything I built, rebrand it, flatten it, erase my fingerprints, then I'd just build something new. But this time it would be mine, and no one would be able to take it away. There's a strange kind of silence that settles over your life when everything that once defined you disappears. Not the comfortable quiet of early mornings or late nights after a long day's work, but a hollow, echoing stillness, like the pause between demolition and rebuild. It filled my apartment like a fog in the days that followed Jessica's revelation. My name was gone from the company website. My access revoked. Projects I had initiated were now credited to the Cole-built team. My voice had been stripped from the narrative entirely. And yet, the world kept spinning. I spent hours staring at the walls of my apartment, sometimes just sitting on the floor next to the unopened boxes, flipping through the pages of old notebooks filled with sketches, cost projections, material sourcing strategies, all once part of a growing empire. Now the paper remains of a legacy I no longer owned. I didn't shave. I forgot to eat. My days blurred, punctuated only by short, tense emails from lawyers and confused texts from colleagues too afraid to ask what had really happened. Then came the call. I almost didn't answer. The number was unfamiliar, and by then, I had grown used to avoiding anything that might drag me further into the mess. But something made me swipe across the screen, my voice dry as I muttered, "This is Jackson. Jackson Cole." A woman's voice, professional but warm. "It's Maya Green. I'm not sure if you remember me. We worked together on the West Ridge Community Project 3 years ago." I sat up, my mind catching the thread of a memory. Maya, the director of a small nonprofit focused on sustainable housing for underserved communities. We had collaborated briefly on an affordable housing initiative in South Tacoma, a low-budget build that had somehow managed to hit every green certification despite the constraints. She had been sharp, determined, full of vision. "I remember," I said slowly. "How are you?" "I've been better," she replied with a dry chuckle. "And I'm guessing you have too. I heard through the grapevine what happened. Or at least the sanitized version." I didn't respond, unsure whether to confirm or deflect. She continued before I could decide. "Look, I won't pretend to understand the politics over at Cole-built. But what I do know is this. I've never forgotten the way you led that project. You made something extraordinary out of scraps. You gave a damn when no one else did. So, I have a proposition." I leaned forward, heart ticking faster for the first time in days. "We just secured a grant to build a new community resource center in North Seattle," she said. "It's small, complicated, tight timeline, tighter budget. Most firms won't touch it. But I thought of you. Would you consider coming on as a consultant?" For a moment, I said nothing. A sliver of light broke through the clouds outside, bouncing off the balcony railing. I looked around my apartment, the boxes, the silence, the invisible weight of humiliation pressing on my shoulders, and I realized something strange. I wanted to say yes. I can't start a new firm," I said cautiously. "There's a non-compete, legal roadblocks, and I'm not exactly in the best headspace right now." "I understand," Maya said gently, "but we can structure it right. You wouldn't be competing. You'd be advising. You'd be helping. That's what you do, isn't it?" I didn't answer right away. Instead, I closed my eyes, picturing the site, a neglected lot, maybe some old concrete slabs, wild grass growing where structure should stand. But I didn't see obstacles. I saw foundations waiting to be laid. I saw opportunity hiding in the margins. "I'll think about it," I finally said. "But thank you. Really." After we hung up, I stared at the phone in my hand. Not a job offer, not a way back into the old world, but something more important, a crack in the dam, a way forward. That night, I opened my laptop and created a new folder, Green Horizon. No logo, no clients, no income, just a name and a blank page. But it was mine. The next day, I called Maya back and accepted. And that was how it began, not with capital, not with fanfare, not even with confidence. Just a phone call, a sliver of trust, a project no one else wanted, and a man with nothing left to lose but his silence. Over the next week, I worked 12-hour days from my kitchen table, diving into research on low-impact construction methods, studying zoning restrictions, sourcing reclaimed materials, drafting a design that could adapt with the weather and breathe with the community. I called old vendors, engineers, and suppliers, not to beg, but to collaborate. Some didn't return my calls. Some said they'd think about it. A few said yes immediately. And with each small win, each email reply, each sketch that took shape on my screen, I felt something begin to stir in me, something that had gone quiet in the weeks since I was cast out. I remembered who I was. Not the VP of Cole Built, not the son of Hank Cole, but the builder, the problem solver, the guy who knew how to pour a foundation with steady hands, even when the ground beneath him was still shaking. There's a moment every builder knows intimately. Right before the first concrete is poured, when the ground has been leveled, the forms are in place, the rebar is set. It's a pause between intention and permanence, where you stand on the brink of something that will either hold strong or crack under pressure. That's where I was, emotionally, professionally, even physically, as I stared down at the printed site plans for the North Seattle Community Resource Center spread out across my kitchen table. It wasn't much on paper. A modest 4,200 square foot space with flexible meeting rooms, a teaching kitchen, a small clinic, and an open-air courtyard that could serve as both community garden and gathering space. But in my mind, it was a cathedral, not in size, but in meaning. It would be the first physical structure to bear the mark of who I was becoming. Not Jackson Cole, the VP, the heir to Cole Built, but Jackson Cole, the founder of Green Horizon. The name had come to me at 3 a.m, one of those nights when sleep refused to stay and memories kept circling the room like moths drawn to regret. I had opened my window, stared out into the silent dark over the rooftops of Capitol Hill, and thought, what would I name something that represents not just rebuilding, but redefining? And there it was, Green Horizon, a place where future and sustainability met, where vision wasn't tied to ego or legacy, but to usefulness. Maya's voice played in my head often in those first weeks, steady, clear-eyed, never sugarcoating. She was knee-deep in bureaucratic red tape and grant deadlines, but every time we spoke, there was a fire in her voice. Not corporate ambition, purpose. She believed in this project like it was a lifeboat for a city slowly drowning in profit-first development. You don't need to prove anything to me, she'd said during one of our calls. But the city? The funders? You'll have to convince them this can be done, and done well. I didn't argue. I just nodded and kept building the proposal deck. The early days of Green Horizon weren't glamorous. My office was a folding table wedged between a shelf of old architecture textbooks and the kitchen counter. My startup capital was a shoestring budget pulled from what little savings I hadn't burned through. I bartered services where I could, offering design input for reduced material costs, mentoring a junior architect in exchange for renderings, leaning on favors from engineers I'd helped years ago when I still had a title that carried weight. Some came through, some didn't. One morning, I emailed Greg Ramirez, an insulation supplier I'd worked with on 3 commercial builds. He'd always been blunt, straight shooting. His reply came 2 hours later. Jackson, heard what happened. Thornton's poison. You're better off. I'll extend you net 60 terms and throw in shipping. Just don't disappear again. We need guys like you. I stared at that email longer than I should have. It wasn't just about materials. It was a reminder that not everyone had bought the story Cole Built was now telling. Slowly, brick by brick, the project took shape. By week 4, we had permits expedited thanks to Maya's connections with the city council. Week 5 brought our first site visit. It was just a patch of uneven land sandwiched between a shuttered grocery store and an abandoned laundromat. But when I walked the perimeter with a clipboard and steel-toe boots, I saw more than dirt. I saw the future. And for the first time in a long time, it didn't look like revenge. It looked like purpose. Still, the doubt crept in at night. What if I failed? What if Thornton had been right? What if I was too idealistic, too academic, too green? I had no marketing team, no board, no investors. Just a design plan, a laptop, and the memory of everything I'd built before it was stolen. But the strange thing about losing everything is that you stop fearing risk the way you used to. There's nothing left to protect. No image, no seat at the table, no name on a door you didn't hang yourself. That clarity becomes a kind of fuel. And with each passing day, I burned it a little brighter. One night, after a long call with a structural engineer who'd agreed to donate a few hours each week, I opened the box that had sat unopened since the day it arrived from Coal-Built, the one with the cracked frame and spilled plant soil. I reached inside, pulled out my old hard hat, and just stared at it. The name was still there, Coal-Built, printed in faded block letters across the front. I ran my fingers over it once, then reached for a Sharpie, crossed it out, and wrote in its place, carefully in clean black ink, Green Horizon. It wasn't just symbolic. It was a promise. Not to go back. Not to prove anything to anyone. But to build something honest. Enduring. My own. By the 6th week of the project, something had shifted, not just in the workflow or the weather or the number of phone calls I fielded every day, but inside me. A current of movement, like tectonic plates grinding back into alignment after months of seismic dislocation. I could feel the weight of inertia breaking, not all at once, but in quiet, persistent motions. A returned email, a favorable inspection, a city planner who called me by name and smiled as she stamped an approval I didn't think we'd get for another 2 weeks. Progress. Small, deliberate, stubborn. The North Seattle Community Resource Center site had gone from an overgrown lot filled with cracked cement and rusted fencing to a place where foundations had begun to take shape, both literal and symbolic. Rebar glinted in the morning light. Piles of timber, insulation, and low VOC sealant arrived daily. Their packing slips signed off by vendors who had once aligned with Coal-Built, but now responded to a new letterhead with my name on it. Green Horizon wasn't just a logo anymore. It was real. We didn't have matching workwear or a polished HR department or a receptionist to answer calls with practiced cheer. We had sweat, elbow grease, determination, and borrowed time. But every day we showed up, there was a little more structure, a little less dirt. And then the unexpected happened. It was Maya who called to tell me first. "You might want to grab a coffee before reading this," she said with a nervous laugh. She was referring to the morning's issue of the Seattle Tribune, folded neatly on my doorstep like it hadn't just detonated a small bomb across the city's development scene. I opened it cautiously, coffee steaming in one hand, and found my name 4 paragraphs deep in a piece titled, "The New Face of Sustainable Construction. Meet the man who walked away from his inheritance to build something better." I sat down hard on the nearest chair. The article was equal parts biography, case study, and quiet expose. It didn't name Coal-Built directly, but it didn't have to. It described the young executive who had stepped aside amid a strategic pivot, only to resurface weeks later leading one of the most ambitious low-income builds the city had seen in years. They quoted Maya extensively. They mentioned my past work, my principles, my pivot. They even mentioned the name Green Horizon. Suddenly, my inbox wasn't empty anymore. There were congratulations from old classmates. A message from contractor I hadn't spoken to in over 5 years. 2 interview requests. And buried among them, one email that stopped me cold. Subject, "You're onto something. Let's talk." JP. It was from Jordan Patel, a partner at Harbor Point Development, a mid-sized firm that had always been quietly admired in the background of Seattle's skyline. A firm known for doing things the right way, even when it wasn't the fastest or most profitable. I didn't reply right away. I just stared at the screen, a strange mix of pride and panic settling in my chest. Was I ready for this level of visibility? For the scrutiny, the expectations, the weight? Maya, ever practical, reminded me what was at stake. This isn't about ego, she said over lunch 2 days later, a sandwich in one hand, blueprints in the other. It's about scale. Impact. If people are finally listening, use that voice to do more. And she was right, because something had changed, something far beyond the steel and lumber rising behind the chain-link fence at the build site. I wasn't just working on a redemption arc. I was building a new model, a new philosophy of construction, of leadership, of partnership. Green Horizon wasn't about proving I could survive the fall. It was about redefining how we build things in the first place. I started working longer hours, not because I had to, but because the vision kept expanding. The community center design evolved too. We added rooftop solar panels donated by a nonprofit in Olympia. A local reclaimed wood supplier offered beams salvaged from a torn-down church. One of my former interns, now a licensed architect, volunteered weekends to help with structural calculations. People were showing up, not because they had to, because they believed. I remember one evening, long after the crews had gone home, walking through the half-frame hallways of the center. The walls were skeletal, the floors still open to the soil, but I could already see it, the heartbeat of the space. I could hear the echo of voices that didn't exist yet, a mother asking for housing help, a teenager learning to fix a bike, a retired vet teaching kids to plant tomatoes in the courtyard. This wasn't just a building. It was a future, and I had helped make it possible. The hard part wasn't over. The financial runway was still tight. The non-compete clause still hovered over me like a storm cloud. I still hadn't spoken to my father. And part of me didn't want to, not out of hate, but because I didn't need the final word anymore. I was writing new ones every day in concrete, steel, and trust. We poured the first footings 2 days after the article ran. I wore my old boots, the ones with the tear at the heel and the paint from 6 projects ago. The sky was overcast, but the ground held firm. As the concrete settled, I stood at the edge of the site and whispered a silent truth I'd only recently begun to believe again. This is only the beginning. It was a Thursday when the past walked through the gates of my construction site unannounced. The crew was breaking for lunch, dust in the air, sawhorses stacked in the far corner, and the hum of compressors winding down for the hour. I was bent over a tablet, reviewing updated electrical layouts with our subcontractor, when I felt a shift in the air, not wind, not sound, but presence. Like something familiar, heavy with memory, stepping into the light whether you invited it or not. I turned and saw him. Ethan Cole, my cousin, once our HR manager. The first person to look away when I was cut from the company. The one who had texted, "Sorry, man. It's just business," when everything I'd built was taken from me. And now, here he was, standing just beyond the fencing with his hands in his pockets, sunglasses perched too carefully on his face, like armor against whatever emotion might be reflected back at him. My jaw clenched before I even knew I was doing it. He raised a hand in a lazy wave. "Hey, Jack." It had been years since anyone called me that. For a brief second, I debated pretending not to see him. I could turn back to my team, disappear in my work, refuse him the courtesy he hadn't extended me. But that wasn't who I was anymore. I nodded toward the gate. "Come on in." He walked slowly, eyes scanning the half-built center like it was something unfamiliar, something he wasn't sure how to categorize. It made sense. Ethan had always been more comfortable with conference calls and catered board meetings than scaffolding and sheetrock. "This is impressive," he said as he approached. Didn't realize it had come this far. I didn't answer. I let the silence do its job. He took off his sunglasses, hesitated, then sighed. "Look, I know I'm probably the last person you want to see." "That's not true," I said. "There are at least 5 people I'd rather avoid more." He smiled, but it didn't touch his eyes. "I've been thinking about reaching out," he said. "I just didn't know how." "You had my number," I said. "You just used it once to send a corporate shrug while I was being shoved out the door." He winced, and for the first time, I saw something cracked behind his carefully managed expression. "I screwed up," he said. "And not just with you. With all of it." I waited. He went on. "The company's falling apart, Jackson. Since you left, it's been one bad call after another. Thornton overpromised and underdelivered. Projects stalled. Budgets ballooned. The luxury builds flopped in the market downturn. Our Seattle property, your West Harbor campus, is underwater. We had to walk away from the Green Line deal. My stomach clenched at that. The Green Line project had been mine. The one I'd pitched, designed, prepared, right before the voicemail had ended my tenure. They're looking to restructure again, Ethan said. But this time, there's no strategy. Just panic. And Dad, he trailed off. I narrowed my eyes. What about Hank? He had a minor stroke. Last month, Ethan said, voice suddenly low. It wasn't in the news. He didn't want it public. But it changed him. He's been talking about legacy. About you. I looked away, out toward the rising frame of the community center. The skeleton of something hopeful. Something honest. Something built from nothing but belief. He's asking for you, Ethan said. I let the words hang between us. After everything, after the voicemail, the silence, the erased credits, the whispered lies, they wanted me to walk back into that house of broken glass and help glue it all back together. I'm not going back, I said quietly. I figured, he replied, but I had to ask. He shoved his hands deeper into his pockets. You were always better at this than I was. Better with people. With vision. I was just the guy who filled out paperwork and kept things neat. You were family, I said. That used to mean something. I know, he said. It still does to me. Even if I didn't act like it when it mattered. We stood there in silence. Two men staring at the space between them that used to be trust. Finally, Ethan turned to leave. He took a few steps, then paused. You built something good here, Jackson. Real good. Maybe even better than what you left behind. I didn't answer. I just watched him go, his figure shrinking against the unfinished walls, the sawdust swirling in his wake like ghosts refusing to settle. That night, I sat on the balcony again, the same one where I had once stared into the void and imagined starting over. And I realized something. I didn't feel rage anymore. Not toward Ethan. Not even toward my father. What I felt was release. Like letting go of the final weight I didn't know I was still carrying. They could keep the company. I had a calling, and it was framed in reclaimed wood, powered by solar, and funded by people who still believed in building things that mattered. The email arrived on a quiet Monday morning, the kind where the world feels still enough to let you believe, just for a moment, that life might finally be leveling out. The crew was already on site. The air smelled like sawdust and morning rain, and I was halfway through my second cup of coffee, reviewing permit updates and juggling subcontractor schedules when the subject line caught my eye. Proposal. National Partnership Opportunity. Confidential. At first, I thought it was spam. Some generic blast from a firm fishing for consultants to slap their names on white papers. But when I opened the message, my posture straightened. The sender wasn't just anyone. Jordan Patel, Managing Partner, Harbor Point Development. I read the body of the email 3 times before I let it sink in. Harbor Point, a firm known for lean design, ethical contracting, and smart, sustainable builds. They had made their name by doing what no one else in the industry had the patience or courage to do: high-quality green development in low-margin urban areas. No shortcuts, no gimmicks, just honest construction that served people, not just portfolios. And now, apparently, they were interested in me. Jackson, we've been watching your work on the North Seattle Community Center project. The Tribune article was well-earned, but more importantly, the results on the ground speak volumes. Green Horizons model is the kind of hybrid approach we've been seeking for a national initiative in early planning stages. We'd like to meet. No pressure, no commitments, just a conversation. Jordan, for a moment, I just sat there, staring at the screen while the rain tapped gently against the windows. In another life, I would have replied immediately, booked a flight, polished my pitch. But this wasn't another life. It was the one I had rebuilt from scratch, brick by brick, after being blindsided, humiliated, and cast out by the very people I trusted most. So instead, I stood, slipped the phone into my pocket, and went back to the site. We were finishing insulation that day, prepping for drywall. The walls were finally becoming rooms. The rooms were becoming purpose. Volunteers moved through the half-formed structure like they already knew what it would feel like to work here, teach here, heal here. I kept my head down. I helped load a pallet. I answered a question about ventilation and climbed a ladder to check a duct route that looked off by a few inches. And still, The message pulled at me like a string tied to my ribs. That night, after the job was done and the crews had cleared out, I walked the shell of the building alone. There's something sacred about empty framing at dusk. The way it echoes your footsteps, the way the twilight sneaks through the spaces where windows will eventually sit. I stood in the middle of what would become the main gathering hall and imagined it not as a single building, but as a template, a model, a blueprint. Because if we could do this here on limited funds and donated materials, in a tight footprint with a scrappy team, what could we do with the backing of someone like Harbor Point? I went home, showered off the dust and doubt, and sat at the table with a pen and notepad, the same one I had used the day I named Green Horizon. I wrote out the pros and cons risks, resources, responsibilities. I listed every reason to say yes, and every fear wrapped around each one. Would this partnership let me expand the work? Yes. Would it put me back into the game I had sworn to walk away from? Possibly. Would it mean compromising? I didn't know. The next day, I called Jordan. His voice was calm, measured, like someone who didn't rush decisions but didn't waste time either. We talked for nearly an hour about philosophy, about cities, about the danger of scale diluting vision. He asked me what I wanted, and for the first time, I said it out loud. I want to build things that outlast people. Not just the materials, but the mission. I want to prove that construction doesn't have to be extractive. It can be restorative. He paused, then said, "That's what we're hoping to invest in." They weren't offering a buyout. They weren't looking to fold Green Horizon into a corporate giant. They want a joint venture, an incubator model for city-by-city expansion. Jackson Cole, Green Horizon, and Harbor Point aligned but autonomous. "We'll put up the capital," Jordan said. "You put up the compass." I didn't answer right away. Instead, I went back to the site that evening and stood at the edge of the build one more time. I watched as two volunteers, teenagers from the local high school, cleaned up scrap wood and rebar without being asked. They were laughing. One of them wore a hoodie with our logo, hand-painted in green spray paint. That was the moment I realized something. What I was building wasn't just a recovery from betrayal. It was a movement, and movements needed momentum. I picked up the phone and called Jordan back. "Let's talk," I said, "but I don't want to just replicate this. I want to evolve it. Every city has different needs, different cultures. This model has to breathe." "That's exactly why we want you," he said. By the end of the week, we had a draft term sheet. By the end of the month, we had a plan to expand Green Horizon to 2 more cities, Denver and Sacramento, with local coalitions and community boards involved from day one. And just like that, I wasn't just a man rebuilding. I was a builder again, not of projects, of possibilities. I hadn't been back to Spokane since the voicemail. Not once. Not for holidays. Not for birthdays. Not even when I heard through quiet channels that my father had suffered a minor stroke. I told myself it was about boundaries, about protecting the fragile structure of the life I was rebuilding in Seattle. But the truth was simpler and sharper. I wasn't ready to face the house that still held my name on the deeds, but none of my presence in its walls. So when the invitation arrived, handwritten and signed by the Spokane Green Build Alliance, it caught me off guard. "Mr. Cole, we're honored to inform you that Green Horizon has been selected to receive the Community Impact Award for 2025. Your commitment to sustainable development, equity in construction, and civic partnerships has redefined what ethical building can look like in the Northwest. We would be thrilled to recognize your achievements in person. The ceremony will be held at the Centennial Center in downtown Spokane, your hometown, and now your proving ground. Warm regards, Andrea Lynn, Director." I sat with the letter for hours before saying anything about it. Not because I didn't know how I felt, but because I knew exactly how I felt. Spokane was where it had all started, where I had first followed my father through unfinished buildings, learned how to hold a hammer, how to read blueprints before I understood half the words on them. It was where Cole Build had gone from an idea to an identity. And it was also where I'd been erased, without a word, without a conversation, replaced like a part gone faulty in the machine of someone else's empire. Still, something in the letter tugged at me. Not just the recognition, but the way it framed the story. Your hometown, your proving ground. That word stuck. Not battleground. not graveyard. Proving ground. Maybe it was time to return. Not for revenge, not for reconciliation, but for acknowledgement of where I had been, of who I had become, and of what I had built in the ashes of what had been taken from me. When I arrived, the city felt smaller than I remembered. The streets were narrower, the buildings less imposing, but the memories? They were vivid. The diner where my dad and I used to have breakfast before early site visits. The old hardware store where I once spent an entire afternoon comparing light switch plates for a project that never broke even. The high school where I gave my first real presentation on insulation materials and their effect on long-term energy costs. I checked into a modest hotel not far from the venue and spent the evening walking the riverfront, trying to gather myself for the next day. The ceremony was scheduled for 6 p.m. I arrived at 5:45, buttoned into a charcoal gray suit that felt both familiar and alien. There were already people inside, milling around with glasses of wine and miniature quiches balanced on paper napkins. I recognized a few faces, former contractors, engineers, even a city planner who used to give me a hard time about height restrictions in residential zones. They smiled when they saw me. Some hugged, some just nodded, but they all said the same thing. "You really did it, Jackson." The ceremony itself was brief. Speeches were short. The applause was warm, not forced. When they called my name, I walked to the podium and tried not to let my hands shake. I scanned the room, my throat tightening. I hadn't expected to see him there. But there he was, my father, sitting in the back row, in a simple blazer, hands folded in his lap, face unreadable. The man who had once held me on his shoulders at job sites now looked smaller, older, almost fragile in the soft light of the auditorium. I cleared my throat, glanced down at the speech I had prepared, and folded it in half. I had something written, I began, but I think I'd rather speak from where this all started. There was a quiet in the room, the kind that comes when people know they're about to witness something not rehearsed, not polished, but real. I grew up here in Spokane, the son of a builder who believed in sweat equity and blue-collar honesty. I learned about construction before I learned about compromise. I watched buildings rise from nothing and believed, maybe naively, that everything could be fixed with the right tools and enough effort. A soft chuckle from somewhere in the middle row. But what I didn't understand then was that foundations aren't just poured into the ground. They're poured into people. And sometimes those crack too. I paused long enough to let it breathe. My journey hasn't been linear. It hasn't been clean, but it's been true. And if there's one thing I've learned, it's this. When someone tries to write you out of your own story, you don't beg to be written back in. You pick up the pen and start a new chapter. There was silence for a beat. Then applause. Not thunderous. Not overwhelming. Just long. Steady. Honest. Afterward, as the crowd dispersed and the lights dimmed, I saw him again, still seated. Still watching. I approached slowly. He didn't stand. "Hi, Dad." He looked up at me, and for the first time in years, I saw something behind his eyes that wasn't pride or disappointment or fear. It was humility. "You were right," he said. And that was it. Not a grand apology. Not an open invitation. Just 4 words that, from him, were more than I'd ever expected. I nodded. "Thanks for coming." He stood slowly, touched my shoulder once, and walked out into the night. And I stood there, alone in the auditorium, the plaque still warm in my hand, the applause still echoing in my ears, and felt something inside me settle for the first time in a long, long while. Not closure, but peace. By the time my plane touched back down in Seattle, the rain had returned, soft, steady, the kind of drizzle that soaks you not with force but with time. I didn't mind. It matched the mood I carried home. Not sadness, not regret, but something quieter and heavier, like reflection pressed into muscle. The Spokane ceremony had closed a chapter one hadn't even realized I was still holding open. I had gone looking for recognition and found, instead, a strange and unexpected reconciliation. Not with my father, not exactly, but with the part of me that still needed something from him. And that was enough. I returned to the Green Horizon office, still modest, still humming with too many moving parts and not enough hands, and was greeted by Amelia, our operations lead, with a crooked smile and a file folder. "Welcome back, boss," she said, pushing the folder into my hands. This one's different. I raised an eyebrow. She was rarely this cryptic. I stepped into my office, closed the door, and opened the folder. Inside was a letter of intent from Artemis Worldwide Development. And the more I read, the more my chest tightened. Artemis wasn't just big, they were colossal. A multinational real estate and infrastructure firm with fingers in everything from modular housing to government-backed energy corridors. They weren't exactly known for their conscience, but they were strategic, calculated, and rarely made offers without knowing exactly what they wanted in return. The letter was clear. They wanted to partner with Green Horizon on a flagship urban renewal project in San Diego. A 70-acre waterfront district that would include affordable housing, commercial space, parks, and a transit hub, all designed to net zero standards. They had the land, the funding, and the permits. What they lacked, they admitted, was credibility, public trust, a face that said, "This is different." They wanted me. They wanted Green Horizon, and they were willing to pay for it. I set the folder down, leaned back in my chair, and exhaled slowly. This wasn't just another step up. It was a rocket. But rockets don't come without fire. I called Jordan Patel that evening. He'd become something of a mentor since the Harbor Point deal. And though his firm had no direct stake in Green Horizon's daily operations, his instincts had been right every time. He answered on the second ring. "Let me guess," he said. "You got the Artemis letter." I paused. "You knew." They asked for references. I gave them one. But I also gave them a warning. "What kind of warning?" "That you're not for sale." I let the silence sit. Jordan sighed. "Look, Jackson, you're the real deal. They know that. That's why they're dangling this in front of you. Because their reputation's wearing thin and they need your authenticity like oxygen." "So what's the play?" I asked. "That depends on what you want. If you partner with them, they'll amplify your work beyond anything you've ever imagined. You'll be designing neighborhoods, shaping policy, influencing national conversations. But you'll also be navigating a sea of stakeholders who don't care about purpose the way you do. They care about optics, timelines, margins. And if I say no, you keep doing what you're doing, slowly, meaningfully, with people you trust. You'll grow. It'll just take longer." I hung up and sat with the decision for days. On paper, it was a dream. National exposure, unlimited resources, a stage no one else in my weight class was standing on. But beneath the numbers, the language in Artemis's proposal had an undercurrent I couldn't ignore. They didn't want Green Horizon to stay what it was. They wanted it to become a division, a brand extension. They offered me creative control, but nothing about structural autonomy. My team could stay, but under their HR. My principals could inform the project, but final approvals would come from a board I didn't control. And somewhere in the fine print was the line that stopped me cold. Green Horizon may retain its name, contingent upon alignment with Artemis brand values. I closed the file and pushed it away, not because I didn't want what they were offering, but because I finally understood what I had already built. Green Horizon wasn't a stepping stone. It was the structure. The next morning, I gathered my team in the office, Amelia, Chris, Diana, 2 new interns who still looked at me like I was more myth than man. And I told them the truth. "We've been offered a shortcut," I said. "A big one. But it comes with a price. And I need you all to know I'm not paying it." Their faces didn't fall. They lit up. Because this wasn't the first time we'd chosen the hard way. It was just the first time we knew, without doubt, that it was ours to choose. Later that week, I drafted a formal decline to Artemis. I thanked them for the offer. I expressed respect for the scope of the project. But I made it clear, Green Horizon will grow on its own terms. No shortcuts. No borrowed names. No compromised foundations. When I hit send, I felt the strangest thing. Not fear. Not relief. But conviction. A sense that, after everything, after the betrayal, the silence, the rebuilding, I had finally stepped fully into my own design. It's one thing to build something from nothing. It's another thing entirely to keep it upright once it starts to matter. After declining Artemis's proposal, I expected the pressure to ease, as if choosing integrity over opportunity would give me some cosmic reprieve. But the opposite happened. It was like standing at the peak of a mountain only to realize it was just a plateau, and the real climb, slippery, steep, exposed, was just beginning. Suddenly, people were watching. Clients, journalists, former colleagues from Colbilt, even industry skeptics who'd once dismissed me as the idealist with a surname. They all wanted to see if I could hold onto Green Horizons principles while navigating the turbulence of expansion. Our inbox overflowed. Bids came in from cities I'd never even visited. Firms asked for collaborations. Nonprofits pitched co-branded initiatives. Everyone wanted a piece of the momentum. It was flattering. It was overwhelming. It was dangerous. Because momentum, if you're not careful, can blur your vision, can turn clarity into speed, and purpose into reaction. Amelia noticed it first. "You're saying yes to too much," she said one afternoon, as we stood at the whiteboard in our cramped back office, trying to make sense of a calendar that had started to look more like a battlefield than a plan. "We've got the capacity," I replied, though my voice sounded more defensive than confident. "Do we?" she asked gently, raising an eyebrow. "Or are you just afraid to slow down because you're not used to being out in front?" I didn't answer right away, because she was right. I'd spent so long proving that I could survive the fall that I hadn't paused to ask what kind of leader I wanted to be now that I was standing. The pain of losing Colbilt had been a forge, but now the fire was behind me. I wasn't fighting to be seen anymore. I was being seen, and I had to decide what to do with that visibility. The North Seattle Community Center opened to the public in June. It was a cloudless day, rare for the Pacific Northwest. Kids ran barefoot through the community garden paths. The teaching kitchen held its first cooking class by noon. A veteran named Luis, who had helped on the build, gave the opening tour with pride in his voice that made my throat tighten. It was a victory, a real one, the kind no headline or contract could match. But even as the ribbon was cut and camera shutters clicked, I felt something tug at me from the edges, an unease like I was holding too many pieces of something fragile. Later that night, I sat in a now-empty gathering hall and watched the shadows stretch along the polished floors. Amelia joined me, 2 coffees in hand. "Do you think we can keep this going?" I asked without looking at her. She sat beside me, her answer immediate. "I think we can keep what matters going, but not if we try to control everything." That was the moment I realized I was still trying to do it all alone. Not out of ego, but out of fear. Fear that if I let go, even for a moment, something would collapse. Fear that trust, once broken, couldn't be rebuilt. That delegation was a prelude to betrayal. But building something meaningful wasn't about guarding it from risk. It was about inviting others to share the weight and the wins. So I changed course. I brought the team together the following week. Not for announcements, not for directives, but for ownership. I asked each department lead, Amelia in operations, Chris in site logistics, Diana in community development, to identify what they wanted to grow, not just what needed to get done. I told them, plainly, that Green Horizon would no longer scale just for the sake of scale. We would pursue depth before width, impact before headlines, people before metrics. It was the best decision I've made since the first brick was laid. In the months that followed, we turned down 2 more flashy offers, one from a high-profile tech campus in Austin, another from a luxury eco-retreat that sounded impressive but rang hollow. Instead, we said yes to a housing rehabilitation program in Fresno, a youth employment center in Tacoma, a mobile build project in Butte, Montana. And through it all, I learned something surprising. Success isn't a destination. It's a pressure test, a daily one, of values, of balance, a belief. The world will always offer you more, but only if you're willing to leave behind what grounded you in the first place. The real work is in knowing what to say no to and why. One night, a month after the center opened, I got a call from Martin Riley, the executive I had once pitched the Green Line deal to back when I still worked for Colbilt. "I just visited the community center," he said. "Had to see it myself." "You really did it, Jackson." I smiled into the receiver. "Thanks, Martin. I had help." There was a pause. "We'd like to talk again," he added. "Green Line's got new leadership, a new vision." "I'm open," I said, then caught myself. "But it depends on the terms." Because I knew now that some opportunities aren't chances to grow. They're chances to compromise. And Green Horizon wasn't built on that kind of ground. It had been years since I'd seen her. And yet, the moment her name lit up on my phone screen, I felt something shift deep in my chest, like a pressure point I'd buried under layers of new purpose, new commitments, new self, suddenly coming alive again. Elena Carter. I hadn't thought about her in months, maybe longer, not consciously anyway. But grief has a strange way of rearranging itself into silence. And love, especially the kind you don't fight for when you should have, tends to show up when your guard is finally down. The message was short. Hey, Jackson. I'm in Seattle for a few days. Conference at the Port Authority. Thought of you. Would be good to catch up, if you're open to it. I stared at the screen for a long minute, then replied, Coffee? She answered with a time and a place. And just like that, a chapter 1 thought I closed, gently, respectfully, quietly, had cracked back open. We met the next morning at an old converted firehouse-turned-cafe in Capitol Hill. She was already seated when I walked in, back straight, scarf tucked loosely around her neck, hands wrapped around a ceramic mug like she was holding something fragile and important. She hadn't changed much. Still had that calm energy that disarmed rooms without effort. Still looked at you like she was listening even before you spoke. Jackson, she said, standing to hug me. You look good. Really good. You always did have a low bar, I said, and she laughed. We sat, and for the first 10 minutes, we danced around the obvious. Talked about the city, the weather, the absurd price of property. She mentioned her promotion, now Deputy Director of Urban Planning for the state of Oregon. I mentioned Green Horizons' new projects without diving too deep. But eventually the pause came. The one where you stop pretending you're just old friends with similar jobs and acknowledge the thing in the room neither of you invited, but both knew would arrive. I saw the article, she said. The one in Architectural Digest. You've done something incredible, Jackson. I said, still figuring out what it means to lead without losing yourself. She nodded. You always carried the weight like it belonged to you alone. I looked out the window. The street was bustling, deliveries, bikes, people late for something important, and it felt for a moment like the world was moving faster than it should. I wasn't ready. I said, finally. Back then. For us. For you. I know, she said quietly. You didn't have to be, but I did. We had met years ago, when Green Horizon was nothing more than a sketch on a napkin and a dream I couldn't afford to say out loud. She had been a city liaison then, helping secure permits for a pilot project in Olympia. We bonded over policy debates, late-night takeout during zoning meetings, and the kind of quiet admiration that doesn't need to declare itself to be felt. But timing is its own kind of architect, and ours was never quite right. I kept wondering, she said after a moment, if it was the mission that came first, or the armor. If maybe you buried the part of you that needed someone, because needing someone made you feel weak. That's exactly it, I admitted. And when I finally looked up, you were gone. She smiled sadly. I wasn't gone. I just stopped waiting. I wanted to say something. Anything. But what do you say when the truth is no longer a key to any door, only a map to where it once stood? She reached into her bag, pulled out a slim folder, and slid it across the table. What's this? A proposal, she said. Not for us. For a project. I opened it. It was an integrated community development, modular housing, micro schools, green tech apprenticeships. Small footprint. Scalable. Designed to serve a vulnerable coastal town in Oregon where housing was vanishing faster than jobs. I want to build this, she said, and I want Green Horizon to help. I looked at the blueprints, the projections, the hand-sketched elevation notes that looked eerily like the ones I used to draw in the margins of my journals. This is good, I said. This is really good. It's not charity, she said. We got state funds, some private partners. But we need you, your team, your blueprint, not just for buildings, for how to do this right. I nodded slowly, heart pounding for reasons that had nothing to do with the budget lines on that paper. You'll be involved? I asked. Start to finish, she said. If you can work with someone who doesn't wait around anymore. We both laughed, but there was something unspoken between us. Acknowledgement without expectation, history without heat, possibility without pressure. I'll bring it to the team, I said. But yeah, I want this. She stood to go. You still build like you mean it, Jackson. That's rare. And then, just before leaving, she leaned in and said softly, don't be afraid to build something for yourself, too. And just like that, she was gone again, this time with no bitterness, no goodbye heavy with what-ifs. Just a door, left slightly open. The road to Astoria hugged the Oregon coastline like an old friend who never quite lets go. Not tightly, but persistently, always there. It was the kind of drive that forced you to slow down, not just for the curves, but for the view, and I needed both. After everything, Seattle, Spokane, Artemis, the ceremony, the memory of my father's quiet nod, I needed a stretch of road where time felt less like a demand and more like an invitation. I arrived in town just before sunset. Astoria was smaller than I remembered, though I'd only ever passed through once in my 20s. It had the kind of charm you couldn't fake. Clapboard houses with peeling paint that somehow added character, sea air that rusted everything, but also reminded you that things age better when exposed to the elements, not hidden from them. The project site sat near the edge of town, a slope that overlooked both the river and the remains of an old cannery. It had once been bustling. Now, it was mostly empty, except for a few kids skateboarding in a lot and one elderly man walking a dog with a limp. But where others saw decline, Elena saw possibility. And now so did I. She met me there the next morning, crisp in jeans, boots, and a navy field jacket, holding 2 coffees like it was still 2016, and we were back arguing over zoning reg by a food truck in Olympia. "Still take it black?" she asked, still pretending I enjoy it that way. I said, taking the cup. She laughed. "You ready for this?" "I think so." "You?" She looked out at the lot, wind catching her hair, her eyes narrowing as if squinting at a future only she could fully see. Been ready longer than I realized. We walked the perimeter, reviewing the layout again. Modular units clustered around shared courtyards. A repurposed factory space transformed into a vocational hub. Solar, rain capture, edible landscaping. All textbook green horizon, but with touches that were hers. A mobile library unit, meditation pods made from recycled shipping containers, local artisan integration. "This isn't just a build," she said. "It's a statement." The town council split. Some see this as salvation. Others think it's a stunt. "Let me guess," I said. "They're worried it's too progressive, too fast, too new." She nodded. "Exactly. And because I'm not from here, I'm still the outsider. No matter how many meetings I attend or how many old fishery widows I've had tea with." "Then we start where we always start," I said. "Not with walls, with people." So that week, we didn't touch a shovel. We hosted town halls. We knocked on doors. We listened, not just to concerns about noise or runoff or traffic patterns, but to stories about what the old cannery meant, about the promise that was broken when the last sawmill shut down, about the shame felt by fathers whose sons left and never came back. One man, Eli Cartwright, 72, retired marine mechanic, stood up at a meeting and said something I'll never forget. "I don't want a tech campus or a photo op. I want my grandson to have a reason to stay." And that became our mission statement. Elena had it printed on the inside cover of every project binder, a reason to stay. Construction began the following Monday. We kept it small, intentionally. No ribbon cutting, no press releases, just steel, soil, and sweat. And slowly, the town began to shift. Skeptics started showing up with coffee and questions instead of protest signs. Local welders offered to teach night classes. A high schooler asked if she could paint a mural on the first community center wall. And somewhere in that flurry of drywall dust and rebar, I noticed something else shifting. Me, not the firebrand, trying to prove he still mattered after being written off. Not the martyr carrying a cause so tightly it left bruises. Just a builder, side by side with someone who didn't need me to be a savior, only a partner. Elena and I never talked about us again. Not directly, but some conversations don't need naming to be real. There was a rhythm between us now, professional but warm, precise but forgiving. We argued less, trusted more, and sometimes, after the day's noise had settled, we'd find ourselves alone in the half-built hub, sipping whatever was left in the thermos, talking about everything but the work. One night, after a late inspection, we sat on the edge of the decking, watching fog roll in from the sea. "You ever wonder what would have happened if we'd gotten timing right?" she asked. I looked out at the mist swallowing the docks. I used to. A lot. And now, I think maybe we needed the break. Not to forget. To become. She nodded slowly, then rested her head briefly on my shoulder. Just for a second. Long enough to feel like something had healed without making a promise it couldn't keep. And that was enough. For now. Because sometimes the strongest foundations aren't built in a rush. They're poured slowly, layer by layer, in quiet moments when no one's watching. Just two people and the courage to start again. There's a particular silence that descends over a town right before it chooses a side. It's not the absence of sound. It's the withdrawal of certainty. You feel it in how people pause before speaking, how they nod instead of answer, how meetings that once ended with handshakes now end with polite will be in touches that carry a weight they didn't last week. That's how I knew something had shifted. It started subtly. The city planning committee delayed our permit for phase 2 of the housing units. Nothing dramatic, just a request for additional review and clarification on traffic impact. Then the local paper ran a lukewarm editorial about the rapid pace of outside-led development. And then our supplier for reclaimed lumber, someone we'd worked with since Olympia, suddenly backed out without explanation. I didn't need a map to connect the dots. I needed a name. It came 2 days later during a tense council meeting when Councilwoman Marcy Dowell let it slip, almost by accident. Well, Mr. Calder raised some good points about infrastructure strain. I think we owe it to the town to consider all voices. Calder. I hadn't heard that name in years. But in the Northwest, especially in towns like this one, real estate developers weren't just players, they were legacies. Brent Calder wasn't a disruptor. He was old money. A third-generation developer with a charming smile and the kind of influence you couldn't buy anymore because it had already been inherited. He'd built resorts in Cannon Beach, shopping centers in Eugene, and a private marina just outside Seaside that had practically rewritten zoning law when no one was looking. And now it seemed he wanted to story it too. I asked around, quietly at first. Contractors, clerks, coffee shop baristas. The answer came back the same from all directions. Calder was proposing an alternative, a revitalization plan focused on upscale rentals, boutique retail spaces, and a heritage museum and conference complex that would honor Astoria's past while embracing its future. The language was slick. The renderings were gorgeous. And the intention? Clear as glass. He was going to box us out with charm and capital. Elena was livid when I told her. He's going to Disney FY this town, she snapped, pacing across the mobile office we'd set up by the site. He doesn't care about housing or jobs or community. He cares about optics and leverage. We knew there'd be resistance, I said, though even I could hear the fatigue in my voice. Just didn't think it would come in a tailored suit and with a full-color brochure. He's meeting with the mayor on Friday, she added. Privately. No agenda posted. No press. That was the moment I realized this wasn't just a contest of ideas anymore. It was a battle for narrative. And Calder was already writing his version. So I asked for a meeting. Not with the mayor. With Brent. We met at a golf course lounge, predictably, just off US 101. He arrived 5 minutes late, dressed in a slate gray suit like he was headed to a ribbon-cutting ceremony rather than a conversation about the soul of the town. His handshake was firm, his smile practiced. Jackson Cole, he said. Heard a lot about you. Likewise, I said. We sat. He ordered bourbon. I stuck with coffee. For a few minutes, we danced. Polite, cordial, almost friendly. And then I asked him, point blank, why Astoria? He didn't blink. Because it's next. Next for what? For opportunity, he said, as if the answer were obvious. It's a sleeping town on prime land. Close to Portland, ripe for tourism, undervalued for too long. The question isn't if it'll change, it's how, and who gets to decide. And your version doesn't include the people already here. It includes the ones willing to adapt, he said, and the ones who benefit from rising property values. You can't save a town by freezing it in place. I looked at him carefully, trying to decide whether his arrogance was real or simply the armor of someone who'd never been told no. Brent, you're not here to partner. You're here to displace. He smirked. I'm here to evolve. And I got city backing, Jackson. You're playing with sentiment. I'm playing with leverage. The meeting ended with no raised voices, no dramatic walkouts, just clarity. This wasn't a negotiation. It was a countdown. Back at the site, I pulled the team together. From here on out, I told them, we're not just building. We're fighting for legitimacy. Every window we frame, every person we hire, every story we amplify, it has to scream this is what real progress looks like. Elena placed her hand on my arm afterward. You good? I nodded. Yeah, just tired of people confusing money with vision. She smiled. Then let's show them the difference. And as the sun dipped low over the scaffolding and the wind from the coast whipped dust through the beams, I realized something. I wasn't angry at Calder. I was angry at the part of the world that still believed he was the only way forward. But we were about to prove them wrong. One structure at a time. Astoria had never felt louder. The closer we got to the vote, the more the town seemed to hum with something volatile. Not quite hope, not quite fear, but something in between. You could feel it in the way conversations shifted when you walked into the diner, in the cautious nods at the hardware store, in the stack of letters and editorials piling up at City Hall, half defending Calder's promises of prosperity, half clinging to what Green Horizon stood for. The final vote was set for Tuesday. 7 council members. One proposal would move forward, ours or Calder's, and the town divided right down the middle. Calder had money, ads, consultants, and a press team that flooded every local news cycle with beautifully animated renderings of a future gleaming in boutique storefronts, rooftop patios, and cruise ship-friendly ports of entry. He'd taken out a full-page ad in the Daily Astrian that said in bold type, "The future is coming. Let's make it beautiful." And he wasn't wrong. His version of the future was beautiful. It just wasn't theirs. It wasn't for the kids who still walked to school past boarded-up houses. It wasn't for the nurses commuting an hour because no rental in town accepted housing vouchers. It wasn't for Eli Cartwright's grandson or the teenage girl who asked us to build a studio so she could teach local art classes without leaving home. Still, Calder was winning hearts. Not because people didn't care, but because people were tired. And fear has a way of dressing itself up as logic when survival is at stake. So we doubled down. That Sunday, 2 days before the vote, Elena organized a community forum. Not an official town meeting, just an open invite at the high school gym with folding chairs, a PA system, and a single promise. Come as you are. We didn't bring renderings or talking points. We brought stories. Amelia spoke about the single father whose home Green Horizon had retrofitted in Tacoma. Diana shared stats from a similar project in Fresno that reduced youth homelessness by 40% in 18 months. I talked about my father, not the ceremony in Spokane, but the man I watched disappear behind blueprints and silence, who taught me to build but never taught me how to stay rooted. And then Elena stood up. No podium, no mic, just her, in a gym full of people holding the weight of 2 futures in their hands. I'm not from here, she said. I wasn't born in Astoria. I don't have a boat named after my grandfather. But I came here because something in this place felt familiar, something you can't fake or buy or design from a desk in Portland. I came here because I believe that small towns don't need to become someone else's vacation fantasy to survive. They need to remember who they already are and be given the tools to grow without disappearing. The applause was quiet at first. Then it rose. Not thunderous, but steady and real. I left that gym knowing we'd given everything we could. Now it wasn't about us. It was about them. Tuesday came with gray skies and damp air, the kind of weather that makes time feel slower. The council chamber was packed. Local press, residents, workers in Carhartt jackets, retirees in fleece vests, even kid from the high school civics class who'd been assigned to observe democracy in action, but sat on the edge of their seats like it was a championship game. Each council member gave a brief statement. Then they voted. 3 for Calder, 3 for Green Horizon. A tie. The room tensed. The deciding vote fell to Councilwoman Nora Jenkins, a lifelong Astoria resident known more for her quiet bookkeeping business than her public speeches. She looked down at her notes for a long moment, then stood. I've lived here 57 years, she said. Raised 4 boys. Lost my husband to cancer, rebuilt my life twice. I've seen this town through logging booms, through decline, through fires, through floods. And what I've learned is this. What saves a town isn't how it looks. It's who it's for. She paused, eyes scanning the crowd. Calder's plan is beautiful. But Jackson Cole's team didn't bring us pictures. They brought us people. And I'd rather bet on people who stay after the camera crews leave. She voted. Green Horizon, 4. Calder, 3. The room exhaled. There were no fireworks. No confetti. Just handshakes. Tears. And the quiet, powerful sound of a community choosing to believe in itself. Outside, under skies just starting to clear, Elena found me on the front steps. We did it, she said. I nodded, a smile tugging at the corner of my mouth. No, I said. They did it. She looked out at the street, where volunteers had already begun planning the next phase of the build, where city workers stood a little taller, where old men in raincoats were calling their sons with pride in their voices. And she whispered, almost to herself, maybe this is how you save a town. The irony of success is that it never feels the way you imagine it will. You expect euphoria, gratitude, maybe even vindication. But what you don't expect, what no one ever tells you, is the slow, creeping sense of detachment that follows when your name becomes a symbol and not a person anymore. 2 weeks after the council vote, with Green Horizons project officially underway in Astoria, I received an email that read like a golden ticket. Dear Mr. Cole, on behalf of the National Institute for Urban Futures, we are thrilled to inform you that you've been selected as the recipient of this year's Architect of Impact Award. I stared at the screen, blinking. National coverage. A keynote address in Washington, D.C. Recognition on the scale I'd once dreamed of when sketching civic hubs in a cramped dorm room at Oregon State. But the timing couldn't have been worse. We'd just broken ground on the second cluster of modular homes, and the community center build had run into complications. Zoning discrepancies, a shipment delay, and a blown transformer that left half the site without power for 3 days. I was in the thick of it again, hands on tools, boots in mud, answering questions about drainage angles and last-minute electrical reroutes like I was fresh out of grad school. Still, part of me hesitated. Wasn't this exactly the kind of platform Green Horizon needed? A national award meant funding, attention, maybe the chance to replicate our model in places like Louisville or Flint or Little Rock, cities that deserved more than proposals and broken promises. But another part of me, quieter, older, remembered something else. It remembered my father's hands, calloused and cracked, sketching out an irrigation system on our kitchen table with a cup of instant coffee balance between blueprints. He never won awards, never gave speeches, but entire neighborhoods stood today because of what he built. Elena noticed the change in me almost immediately. You've been somewhere else these last few days, she said one night after we wrapped the team debrief by lantern light. You thinking of leaving? I shook my head. Not permanently, just stepping away. For the award. She nodded, slow and unreadable. And what does it mean to you? The award. I paused, longer than I should have. It means validation, I guess. That we're being seen. That what we're doing matters. She stepped closer, brushing sawdust from her sleeves. We're already being seen, Jackson. Every time a kid walks through the frame of a house, they'll sleep in next month. Every time someone calls you by name instead of by title. You don't need a stage to matter. But don't we need reach? I pushed. Don't we need scale to survive? She looked at me with the same calm clarity that used to unnerve me back when we first met. Survival isn't the goal. Change is. And if reaching further means letting go of what made this real, then maybe it's not reach, it's distraction. Her words hit harder than I expected. Because deep down, I knew she was right. That night, I opened the email again. Read it top to bottom. Thought about who I was before Green Horizon and who I'd become because of it. And I realized something quietly devastating. I hadn't built Green Horizon to be seen. I'd built it to see people like Eli, like Diana, like the single mother in Fresno who cried when we handed her the key to her new front door. I'd built it to see the towns no one sent press releases about. The lives between headlines. So I wrote back, Dear Selection Committee, thank you for the honor. I'm grateful beyond words, but I must respectfully decline. There's too much to do here, and my place for now is not behind a podium, but in the dirt next to the people who made this possible. I didn't tell anyone right away, not because I was ashamed, but because I didn't need applause. The next day, I showed up on site at 6:15 a.m. with a thermos of lukewarm coffee and a crooked smile, ready to help re-pour the foundation slab that had cracked overnight from a temperature drop. Amelia smirked when she saw me. Didn't expect the CEO today. I grinned. Neither did he. And just like that, I was back. Not as a figurehead, not as a nominee, but as a builder. And in that moment, under a gray Oregon sky with my hands deep in concrete mix, I finally understood something my father had known all along. Some legacies aren't built in front of cameras. They're built in the quiet, heavy work of staying present. It was a Friday afternoon when the first tremor hit, not the kind you feel under your feet, but the kind that rattles your gut before your brain catches up. We were finalizing the solar grid install on the east side of the vocational hub when Diana pulled me aside. Her face was tight, jaw set the way it always was when she'd rehearsed something in her head a dozen times and still hated the sound of it. "Got a minute?" she asked. I nodded, wiping my hands on my jeans as we stepped away from the site. She handed me a printed spreadsheet, then another, and then a third one with highlights and margin notes in her tidy, all-caps handwriting. "What am I looking at?" I asked. She didn't answer. Not right away. Instead, she pointed to a line item, supplier invoice, reclaimed composite panels, $18,400. Then she pointed to a second sheet. Same panels, same supplier, but the invoice listed $12,250. And the third sheet? It was an internal requisition form with a digital signature I knew too well. Amelia Vaughn. I stood there, holding all three sheets like they were in a language I'd suddenly forgotten how to read. Diana said quietly, "It's not the only discrepancy, just the first I traced." I felt the weight of it land in my chest, slow and suffocating. "Have you talked to her?" I asked, my voice low. She shook her head. "Thought you should." I walked back toward the office trailer in a haze. Each step felt like it echoed, louder than the last, though I knew logically the sound was in my own head, bouncing around like a warning bell I hadn't wanted to hear. Amelia was at her desk, typing something into the site management software, earbuds in, hair pulled into a loose braid like she hadn't slept much. "Hey," I said gently. She looked up and smiled. "What's up?" I closed the door behind me, held up the pages. Her face changed instantly. Not guilt, not fear, but resolve. She stood, folded her arms. "You saw them," she said. "Not what is this, not where did you get that. Just confirmation." I felt a hollow open up in my chest. "Why?" She leaned back against the desk, like she'd been bracing for this moment for weeks. "I didn't steal the money, Jackson. I redirected it." "To where?" "To cover the gap on Lot C's insulation. To rush order replacement tiles after the shipment from Portland got warped in the rain. To pay subcontractors when our reserve fund stalled. I kept us afloat." "At a markup?" I asked. "Without disclosure?" She shook her head slowly. "I did what I had to do. You were off giving speeches, dodging awards. I was here, making sure things didn't fall apart." That cut deeper than I expected, because she wasn't wrong. Not entirely. "Amelia," I said, my voice thick with anger I wasn't ready to name, "this team runs on transparency. Trust. If that goes, everything goes. I saved us from missing deadlines that would have killed this project," she snapped. "If I waited for committee approval, those families would still be waiting for walls. And now we might lose everything because of your shortcuts." She stared at me, hard, then sat back down, and said nothing. I left without another word. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat at my kitchen table with those 3 sheets of paper, replaying every staff meeting, every budget review, every moment Amelia had stepped up, filled in, stood by me. She wasn't a thief. She was something far more dangerous to a mission like ours. She was a believer who had stopped believing in the rules. By Monday, word had leaked. Not the details, but the fracture. You could feel it in how people spoke more carefully, how tools clanged harder, how laughter disappeared from lunch breaks. We called an emergency team meeting. Everyone was there, Elena, Diana, the crew leads, the volunteers, even city reps who'd been monitoring our bill from the sidelines. I stood at the front, papers in hand. Amelia sat at the edge, eyes unflinching. I won't spin this, I said. We had a breach of process, internal misallocations, financial decisions made without proper channels. Murmurs, furrowed brows. Then I held up the paperwork. And yet, because of those choices, Lot C has walls. Power. Insulation. Because of those choices, 3 subcontractors got paid on time. Because of those choices, we are ahead of schedule. A silence settled. I turned to Amelia. What you did violated our core process. But you didn't do it for personal gain. You did it because you didn't trust us to handle crisis the right way. She didn't respond. Didn't need to. I turned back to the team. I'm not excusing it, but I'm also not condemning it without reflection. We built this to serve. That includes how we handle our own mistakes. Our own people. The room was quiet. Then Elena stood. We don't need martyrs. We need accountability. And we need grace. That was all she said. But it was enough. Amelia stepped down from her post that afternoon. Not fired. Not exiled. But stepping back. To reflect. To rebuild trust. And as I watched her walk away from the trailer toward the project site, tool belt still on, head held high, I realized something I'd forgotten. Sometimes, the people who break the rules believe the most in the mission. They just forget the mission isn't survival. It's integrity. It had been 14 years since I'd seen my brother. Not in passing. Not through a phone screen. Not even in a tag photo on social media. 14 years of silence, buried under drywall and deadlines, under the belief that some bonds don't mend. They just get left behind like tools you no longer use but can't quite throw away. So when I stepped out of the site trailer on a cloudy Wednesday and saw Lucas standing by the fence, hands in his coat pockets, same sharp jawline, but with streaks of gray near the temples, I froze. For a second, I thought maybe it was a hallucination. Maybe all the stress, the back-to-back storms, the confrontation with Amelia, the late-night budgeting sessions had finally cracked something loose in my brain. But then he raised one hand, tentative like he wasn't sure if he was waving or surrendering. Hey, Jack. The voice hadn't changed, just softened, like time had sanded down the edges. I didn't move, didn't speak, just stared, because the last time we'd spoken, really spoken, was at our father's funeral. And even then, we hadn't shared more than 6 words. Now here he was, standing on the edge of the work I'd built with my bare hands, looking out at the framework of homes that weren't just structures, but promises. What are you doing here? I finally asked, my voice flat. Lucas stepped forward, slow, like he was careful not to startle the air around us. I was in Portland for a job. Read about the vote in the Register Guard. Thought I'd see it for myself. I wanted to laugh. Or maybe scream. You came all this way to look at lumber? He looked past me toward the east end of the site, where the community kitchen was taking shape, volunteers painting baseboards, a kid with Down syndrome handing out water cups to workers like he was the foreman. No, Lucas said. I came to see what kind of man you turned into when you stopped running. The words landed like gravel against concrete. Sharp, grinding, hard to ignore. I took a step closer. Funny, I was about to ask you the same thing. There it was, the old tension, rising between us like a fault line, too familiar to be forgotten, too raw to pretend didn't still ache. But then he did something I didn't expect. He smiled. Not sarcastic, not bitter, just tired and human. I deserve that, he said. We stood in silence for a beat, the wind picking up sawdust and tension alike. I read about what you're doing here, he said. The housing, the apprenticeships, the way you fought the Calder proposal. It's impressive. Don't say it like I built a tree house, I snapped. This isn't a hobby. This is lives. I know, he said softly. I came because I realized I never told you that. He looked at the dirt, then back up at me. You were always the one with vision. I just never figured out how to follow it without feeling like I was walking in your shadow. My chest tightened, because for years, I thought Lucas resented me for leaving home, for chasing dreams he couldn't afford to believe in, for not being there when Dad got sick, for disappearing into a life made of projects and progress instead of holidays and phone calls. But now, he was telling me something else, that maybe we were both ghosts in each other's past, and maybe neither of us had been brave enough to say it out loud. You won't walk the site? I asked. His eyebrows lifted in surprise. Yeah, I'd like that. So we did. I showed him the units. The vocational wing. The therapy garden we'd planned with local veterans. The mural wall, still waiting for the town's kids to fill it. And somewhere between the solar shed and the rainwater catchment tanks, Lucas said something that caught me off guard. I've been working with a nonprofit, helping train ex-cons in HVAC installation. It's not much, but it's something. I stopped walking. That's more than something. He shrugged. You think they'd let me pitch in? Even for a day? I looked at him, really looked at him, not as the brother who'd vanished or the kid who stayed behind to clean up the messes, but as a man who, like me, had been building something quiet and difficult and invisible to the world. I nodded. Yeah, I think we've got a tool belt with your name on it. That night, for the first time in a long time, I didn't think about the past with regret. I thought about foundations and how some of them take longer to set. But when they do, they hold up more than walls. They hold up the future. It began with a whisper, a soft warning on the local radio station. Low-pressure system moving in from the Pacific. Possibility of heavy rainfall. Nothing dramatic, just Oregon weather doing what it does best. But by nightfall, that whisper had grown teeth. By morning, it had a name, Winter Cyclone Rex. And by the time the first surge of wind tore through the Astoria coastline, it wasn't a storm anymore. It was war. I stood at the edge of the construction site around 5:30 a.m., rain slicing sideways across my face, watching as our north scaffolding, weeks of careful assembly, groaned like an old man's knees and collapsed in on itself with a crash that shook the trailer behind me. Water poured from the sky in sheets, blurring the outlines of homes not yet finished, dreams not yet framed in drywall. Elena arrived soaked, eyes wide with disbelief. Lucas, now 4 days into working with the HVAC crew, jogged up to us, his hair dripping, his mouth set in that same grim line I used to see when we were boys and knew Dad was about to lose his temper. The water's pooling along the southwest trench, he shouted over the wind. If we don't divert it, it's going to flood the foundation on Lot 7. Sandbags? I asked. We'll need more than that. The city had declared a regional emergency by 9 a.m. Main roads were closing. Trees fell across power lines. And our site, our proof of progress, of purpose, of persistence, was drowning under the weight of wind and water. We had two options: pull back or dig in. I looked around at the volunteers who had shown up anyway, wrapped in ponchos, gripping tool buckets like shields, their boots ankle-deep in mud, but their spirits unshaken. And I made the call. We're staying, not because we were reckless, because we remembered what it felt like to be abandoned by systems that saw cost before compassion. And we weren't about to let that happen to Astoria. Not on our watch. We formed teams, one for drainage diversion, one to reinforce the retaining wall behind the vocational building, one to tarp anything we could save. Diana coordinated with the fire department for backup pumps. Elena rerouted all electrical gear to higher ground. And I shoveled water and cursed at the sky and felt something I hadn't felt in months. Clarity. This wasn't just a test of construction. It was a test of conviction. For 12 hours, we battled wind, mud, fatigue, and panic. Lucas worked like a man, trying to atone for every missed birthday and ignored message, pulling soaked insulation out of storage like it was gold. At one point, one of the support beams on the new community kitchen gave out with a sickening crack. Amelia, back on site, still rebuilding trust, ran into the storm without hesitation, shoring up the structure with 3 others and a crowbar like she had something left to prove. By nightfall, we were exhausted, but we were still standing. And so was the site. We'd lost parts of the garden, a tool shed, some framing along the northwest wall. But not the heart, not the mission. And when the skies finally cleared, bruised purple and streaked with cold orange light, we stood in the muck, soaked and trembling, and we laughed. Not out of joy, out of defiance, out of pride, out of the knowledge that what we'd built wasn't fragile. It wasn't pretty renderings or grant money. It was stronger than that. It was earned. That night, as I stood in the makeshift office with steam rising from the portable heaters and the smell of soaked lumber thick in the air, Elena looked at me, eyes still shining with adrenaline. "We're going to finish this," she said. I nodded. "No," I replied. We're going to remember this. Because some victories don't come with applause. They come with scars and mud and the silent agreement between people who chose to stay when every instinct told them to run. It was a small ceremony. No ribbon cutting, no podiums, no national coverage or corporate sponsorship banners flapping in the wind. Just folding chairs on fresh concrete, paper lanterns strung between the newly planted trees, and about 70 people, some with tool belts still slung over their hips, others with tear-streaked cheeks and dirt still under their fingernails. The final nail had been driven into the community center doorframe that morning. We didn't mark it with speeches. We marked it with silence. And then applause. The kind that doesn't explode. The kind that hums. Like the kind you hear when people know they've done something that matters. Elena stood beside me, holding a clipboard with a resident list. 43 families who would have roofs over their heads before spring turned to summer. Lucas was helping a young single mom move a donated crib into Unit 14B. Amelia handed a set of keys to a teenage boy whose family had been on the waiting list since we broke ground. I found myself drifting to the edge of it all, where the noise softened, where I could watch without being seen, where I could feel the full weight of what we'd built, not just in wood and steel, but in trust, in sweat, in second chances. "You're gonna leave, aren't you?" I turned. It was Diana, arms crossed, eyes steady. She wasn't accusing me. She was stating a truth she'd already made peace with. "I don't know," I said, but I did, because something had been pulling at me in the quiet hours. Early mornings before the site stirred to life, late nights walking the rows of finished homes under the glow of floodlights. It wasn't restlessness. It was readiness. This project was never meant to be the destination. It was the blueprint. And somewhere out there, another town was waiting for its foundation. "Lucas is staying," I said. "He's good. Quiet but dependable." Diana nodded. "Yeah, he's you. 10 years ago." That hit deeper than I expected. I found Elena later, sitting on the edge of the garden beds with a cup of cold tea and a notebook in her lap. "Thinking of planting wildflowers," she said without looking up. "Low maintenance. Good for the bees." "Always thinking 10 steps ahead," I said, smiling. She smiled too, but there was something behind it. Something unsaid. "You told me once that some legacies aren't built in front of cameras," she said. "That they're built in the dirt." I nodded. She closed the notebook. "Well, this one's in good hands now." For a moment, we just sat there, watching kids chase each other across the lawn that used to be scaffolding and gravel. "I'm proud of you, Jackson," she said quietly. "I didn't do it alone." "No," she said, "but you stayed long enough to teach the rest of us how to lead." That night, as the lights dimmed and families filtered back to their new homes, I walked the perimeter of the site one last time. Every house had lights on. Every window told a story. Laughter echoed across the breezeway. And I knew it was time. The next morning, before the sun came up, I packed my truck. Nothing dramatic. Just a few bags, a thermos of coffee, and a folded map with a circled name. Red Bluff, California. Another forgotten town. Another blank page. But I left something behind in Astoria. Not guilt, not regret. Legacy. Real and rooted. A small plaque on the community center wall read, "Built by hands that believed." For people who never stopped. And as I drove south with the coastline beside me and a sky just starting to bleed gold behind the trees, I realized something I wish I'd known years ago. The most powerful things we build in this life aren't walls. They're people. If this story moved you, even just a little, don't let it end here. Leave a comment below. What would you build if nothing stood in your way? Hit the like button to support real stories that matter. And if you're new here, subscribe for more powerful journeys of resilience, redemption, and rebuilding. Because sometimes the blueprint for change starts with just one person picking up the first nail.